In case you haven't heard, in many red states, there has been lots of pushes to get CRT banned from schools, and many of these pushes have been pretty successful, having many bills throughout plenty of states being passed and signed by the executive to the effect that CRT and its concepts are banned from being taught in school, and yet it is still being taught in many of these schools because a lot of these CRT ideologues, which have been teaching it with impunity for the past few years, or past few decades, assuming how long this has been going on, don't want to give it up. And they have been doing this in a number of very novel ways, whether it be by obfuscating the question by saying, well, I'm not actually teaching it, I'm just answering the questions from the students that I suggest they ask me. Which is technically not illegal, because the letter of the law says I can answer any questions from the children that I want, in any way that I wish. Or you'll get the even more pernicious thing of saying that, well, what I'm teaching, whether it be the white supremacy past of the US or white privilege and why it's bad, is not actually CRT, despite sharing all of the major concepts of which, and basically only being not being CRT in name and being the same as it in every other aspect. And this has been something that has not gone on for quite a long time. It's a long-running tactic of the left, and I want to explain it here to you because, well, it's something that the right has mostly missed out on. I mean, we're getting better at it. As I've stated before, much of this would have gone completely without notice if it had happened 30 years ago. But it still needs to be said, and so I will. One of the major examples of this happening, I would say, is with the trans debate, where much of the argument in the first place with the entire thing is a definitional argument. But if you ever even bring up the definitional argument, they will say something to the effect of, well, that's not the core of the debate. The core of the debate is that I'm right, which is something that a head of party in the UK, Liberal Democrats, head of party, stated directly. And this is on top of their continuing revisionist definitions that they've been doing on this particular subject. Because at this point, many of the leftists have gone to the point where they're even saying biological woman is a social state. A simple absurdity, of course, especially considering that they were making a big old point about the idea that sex is the biological concept, and gender is the social construct, which seems to be completely worthless now, because now they're trying to combine the definitions anyway. This is most evidently seen in the idea that trans women are women, that we're going to completely remove the distinction entirely, because discrimination is such a huge problem. This is part of the core of the tactic. They want to create a more inclusive language, and a part of that it has to do with changing the definitions of words to make them less discriminatory, when in fact the purpose of words themselves is to discriminate between separate concepts. That is the core of this particular tactic, but it's not only used among leftist ideologues. It's not only used in the places like TikTok. It goes all the way to the top. In fact, one of the most common users of this particular tactic would, in fact, be the medical establishment, who have been doing this for literal decades. I mean, just take, for example, gain-of-function research, a word which was already a weasel word to say bioweapons research without saying bioweapons research, which has now been redefined again into being something more specific so that we can do bioweapons research, which is gain-of-function research, but not call it gain-of-function research. This itself is the core of the Fauci-Rand Paul debacle, because what Fauci was doing there was simply holding a definition of gain-of-function research, which had only come into existence after gain-of-function research had been banned in order to get around said ban. And that is what leftists do with this tactic continually. If they ever have a part of their ideological subversion removed from whatever situation they're in, whatever institution is trying to push it, whenever they are being limited in their goals in any way, all they have to do is simply move around it by redefining all the terms. And that is what they do with commonly. And it might seem at first blush like a completely unbeatable tactic, because how exactly are you supposed to manipulate the language back at them? Well, first thing you have to understand is that the leftists don't understand language the same way you do. You see, when you're talking to most right-wingers, or basically normal people who aren't leftist ideologues, people will understand language to be a common understanding, that everyone needs to basically understand the language and all the definitions, and everyone needs to agree on the definitions before we can really have a conversation to begin with. But the leftists do not believe that. The leftists can redefine terms at any given moment, at any given time, so long as they have the vise of having a more inclusive language, or being less problematic, and those sorts of things. And my suggestion to beat this tactic, it's not to do what you might think. It might be not to push back on it fully, though in certain circumstances that could certainly be a good way to do it, especially if they're using multiple definitions in a particular conversation. But instead, to do a little bit of verbal aikido, where you use their tactics and push them off into a spiked wall. Because what you can do if someone is attempting to manipulate the definitions around you to make the language as inclusive as possible is to go full inclusive. Simply say, well, saying that someone is a trans woman in the first place is discriminatory and it's promoting trans genocide. Say something to that effect. Or say something like, black people and calling people black people is itself racism because you're discriminating against them in comparison to white people, which is also a discriminatory and white supremacist term. Those sorts of things are very effective against them because they have no argument against them. And I know it ends up looking a bit like a contest of how much you can say without saying anything at all, but hey, I didn't say there wouldn't be any adverse consequences. That's where I'm going to leave you guys off. If you enjoyed that video, do in fact subscribe down below and check me out on other platforms. I have a BitChute, I have an Odyssey, I have a Rumble, Brighteon, and all those sorts of things. I also have a Minds and Gab page. And also check me out on breakingonthedaily.locals.com for that community. I'm KelKidman, this has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.